All doing today. My name is Jordan McCracken-Foster. I am a teaching artist here at Art Prof, and I am here today with the one and only Prof Lieu. And today we are going to be talking about the rivalry between painting and illustration. And so if you want to make your artistic weakness your strength, then definitely check out our website at artprof.org, where you get free tutorials and critiques and lots of other good stuff. So now I want to start off the discussion by asking Clara, what is the difference between painting and illustration?
Well, I could talk to you guys for 100 hours about that. So I'm just going to give you a really shallow version of what the difference is. For me, it's that illustration has a very particular intent about communicating a very specific idea. And for that reason, if an illustration is made and people don't understand what that idea is, that to me is a failed illustration because it did not do what it set out to do. Now, painting can communicate any number of things, but it's not remotely as specific. I think about an illustration as something you would pick up a newspaper and there's an illustration to accompany the article, whereas a painting is in the context of a gallery. What about you? How do you distinguish the two, Jordan?
My thoughts are actually very similar. I always define illustration as telling a story. So whether it be a book or maybe even a poster for a movie or something like that, and showing what the movie's about, those things can all be labeled as illustration. Whereas painting, I've always actually kind of went back and forth about it because it's a medium. Obviously, it's like it's a style of working, but I've noticed that painters tend to be a little bit more free with it. You probably wouldn't call a super abstract like Jackson Pollock piece an illustration. And I think there's a wide range of things that you can do and it just happen to fit in that bubble. So while painting is like super large, illustration slightly smaller and more focused.
Yeah, and what we're really going to be talking about is I think there is somewhat an illustration stereotype and a painting stereotype. Like to me, a really fine arty painting is a 20-foot tall, gigantic painting, and there's two paintings in this huge white cube gallery in Chelsea, New York. I mean, that's one extreme. The other extreme, I would say, is it's an illustration in the New York Times that's talking about some contemporary article that somebody just wrote. So you have those extremes. However, there's a lot in between. And what Jordan and I really want to address today, where is the line? Is there a line between painting and illustration? And how do we figure out where that line is, if it even exists? So for example, Slepneer is saying here, there can be a crossover between the two. And this is where it gets really, really interesting. So what we're going to do now, we have two images for you guys to look at. Stylistically, they're somewhat related. One of them is by somebody who really is known as a, quote, illustrator. The other one is by somebody who is known as a, quote, painter, because a lot of artists really are labeled in that way, a painter or an illustrator. So tell us in the chat which one you think is the illustrator and which one you think is the painter. So just write in the chat, left illustrator or right painter. Let's see what you guys think about this.
As you guys are writing and deliberating on what you think, I wanted to bring up this comment by Lisa H. And this is a really good example of something here. Illustration can be many different mediums, pen and ink, for example. And that's something that is very true because illustration can be, the pen and ink, or it can be a pencil drawing, or it could be an oil pastel, or whatever the case may be. But painting, when you hear that, if you don't see a painting, then there's probably going to be lots of questions there. So I just definitely want to bring that one up.
Well, so Jordan, what do you think are maybe some of the signals between these two images that might sway you one way or another?
Mm-hmm. So personally, I would say the one on the right is an illustration. The reason I think that is because one, it seems to be telling a story very clearly about these poor pigs and being slaughtered and everything. And then the lighting that's being used is all helping to continue pushing that story forward. Whereas the image on the left, while there is some story element there, it's not really very clear, and it feels like things with the composition, the lighting, the color tone, all that stuff isn't as well thought out.
Well, you could argue, though, Jordan, that perhaps having a narrative that's a little bit more ambiguous, maybe that's an illustrator who's really trying to get you to think. Because sometimes if the narrative is too obvious, it's actually not a very good illustration, because then it's not really getting to engage you in that way. So it's tricky. And you know something? We have a lot of people who have different opinions here. It's not everybody thinking the same thing. Like Vincent is saying left is the illustrator. Tiago says left is the painting. And Keith Larson is saying, but do you mean, quote, painting or fine art? I guess for the purposes of this stream, we're talking about fine art painting, if that makes any sense. We could have said all fine art, but I think that's a little bit too broad. So really what we're focusing on for this stream, we picked illustrators who paint and painters who are fine artists. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. So we have Kate Chandler. The one on the right had dynamic movement, so there's more of a narrative. And Denise is saying they both look like paintings to me. Okay, so there's not really a consensus here, right? And this is where things get really, really interesting. So let's tell you now. On the left is Marlene Dumas, who is a painter in the fine arts world and who really, I think, has set a lot of records at auction for Sotheby's and Christie's, and she's a very famous female fine artist. On the right is Sue Coe, who has done some fine art stuff, but she really is known as an illustrator. So here's the thing, Jordan. Both of these artists have a lot of stylistic similarities. So why do you think Sue Coe is labeled illustrator and Marlene Dumas is labeled painter?
Well, actually, I think that Alyssa made this point really clear, and I actually kind of echo this. I think illustrations tell stories more deliberately, and paintings are more interpretive. And so with the previous slide and with this one, I think that some of the elements are just, you don't really know what's going on. You're interpreting it, you're trying to figure it out. But with Sue Coe, you're seeing all these different things that are trying to push you forward. Like I could very easily see this in a storybook. Well, granted, some of them might be violent storybooks, but you know, that's kind of the vibe that I'm getting from it. And I keep hanging on that as like, that's like the biggest difference. And when I was a student, that was always the thing. Just tell a story with your image.
Well, it just makes me wonder, though, are we saying then that illustration communicates clearly and fine art is ambiguous, that if you understand it better, therefore it's an illustration? Because actually some of my favorite illustrations are ones that are very ambiguous and that maybe make you think a little bit differently. I mean, of course, there's a million versions out there, but that's one way to think about it. And another thing, oh, actually, let's look at this comment from Kate. Do artists get designated for the rest of their careers according to their educational background? Would an artist educated in illustration have more trouble transitioning if they want to paint? What do you think, Jordan?
I have never heard of anyone being pigeonholed because of their education to becoming an artist. I mean, it might be because I'm young and I'm less experienced, but I've never heard that being an issue. I know several people who studied illustration and went to do UI UX, which is sometimes more of a graphic design type of field. I know some people who did painting and now are game designers. One person actually is a concept artist who studied furniture that I know of. And so it just varies. I've never heard that being something that is restricting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you guys know this, but my undergraduate degree is in illustration. Guys, I've never done an illustration in my life professionally, not once. And I'm totally a fine art painter. So it more has to do with what you do after you get your degree. Because honestly, after you are done with art school, people just want to know, did you get the degree? They don't really care so much about what it was in, unless you're teaching. That's sort of a different story. Okay, well, let's take a look at some more images by Marlene Dumas and also Sue Coe. And I guess what we also want to talk about here is, did Sue Coe set out to be an illustrator, or did she just make stuff and get labeled an illustrator? Or is it just about context? because here Marlene Dumas, she's in a fancy white cube gallery. Suko is on the cover of the illustration of the New Yorker. So Jordan, do you think it's about just where you put your work and that determines if it's illustration or fine art?
It might have something to do with that. The thing with like things like the New Yorker is oftentimes you're giving a prompt to figure out what it is that you're going to create. And so I guess depending on how you interpret the text, then that will really show in the final piece, whether it leans more towards illustration or more towards fine arts kind of approach or something that's more abstract. And I think oftentimes artists will try to force themselves into a specific career that they want to go in because maybe they don't want to be identified as an illustrator. Maybe they want to be more of a fine artist, and so they'll make those kinds of decisions in their career as well.
All right, well, let's move on and take a look at the next pair of artists. So again, while Jordan and I take a look at these, tell us which one is the illustrator and which one is the painter, left or right. And this one's trickier because they're both magazine covers. And yet we're going to tell you that one of them is a painter, one is an illustrator. So this is strange because a lot of people think about a magazine cover as illustration territory. And yet why is the painter managing to pull that off? That's the big question. Now, while you guys try to figure it out, one of the reasons we came up with this stream is because this is a rivalry that definitely exists at art school. Did you guys have this, Jordan, when you were in art school, this rivalry?
I think there was definitely a line between someone who wanted to do the more like traditional like comics or magazine covers, and then there were some who were trying to do more their own thing and explore a bit more. So it wasn't a very severe rivalry, but there was definitely a small chasm there.
Well, this rivalry existed when I was in art school, which is in the 1990s. And if I were to give you guys the most shallow version of it, basically the illustrators thought that the painters were pretentious snots, and the painters thought that the illustrators had sold out and were no longer creative people anymore. That's the most shallow version. But I think there is a lot of, I guess, assumptions that people make about different fields that, oh, well, the illustrators, they're just slaves to their clients. As Neil is asking, do illustrators always work for a client? Sometimes and sometimes not. For example, you could get hired by Time magazine and they say, oh, we want to cover about this. But there's a lot of people who write and illustrate their own children's books, in which case there's not a prompt. You just come up with your own story and you illustrate it. So yeah, I mean, Jordan, was it very divisive when you were in art school, or was it a little bit more tame?
It was pretty tame, actually. I think a lot of people were supportive of each other. And I feel like what happens is the people who are in that sort of mindset of wanting to do like whatever particular medium or project, whether it's comics or something, will kind of turn themselves into a clique almost, and they'll stick together, and then they'll take certain classes as well. So unless there's someone who really wants to just take from everything, you'll probably end up merging into your own little group.
And that happens everywhere, not just in art school. People get cliquey and annoying, and it's a bummer because don't you think that you're missing out if you do that?
Yes and no. I think that it's necessary and valuable to receive information outside of your interests. However, I do think there's a balance, because there are times where you take a class or you learn something that doesn't have anything specifically to do with what you're trying to do. And if you're pressured by finances or trying to find a job right out of school, then that could be difficult for some people. I was actually talking to someone today who was explaining that a lot of the classes she took in art school were not worth it for her, and how much that really impacted her leaving school and trying out to find a job. So it's tricky.
All right, looks like on this one, we have way more of a consensus. Most people here are thinking that the illustrator is on the left and the painter is on the right. Okay, so let's take a look. You guys were correct. Anita Kunz is on the left-hand side, and John Curran is on the right as a painter. So tell us in the chat, now that we voted, what made you think that the painter was on the right? Because unlike the other one where people really had totally different opinions, most people really agreed on this one. So Jordan, why do you think that is? Why is the left one side seem more like an illustrator's work?
I would say the core of it is that it's caricaturized, and that it's meant to, the proportions are being pushed and pulled. The nose is obviously a dead giveaway, and it relates to the title of the article that's being on there as well. And so those elements, I think, really help put in the mind, okay, this is something that's supposed to be a little silly, but just this, the style of this painting happens to be slightly more realistic than something that's more flat.
Well, we have a comment here from Goom Bonica. I've always viewed illustration as more whimsical and fantastic. Fine art feels more graceful and serious, but both can be either, just stereotypes, maybe. I would say that's a stereotype because actually what's interesting between Anita Kunz and John Curran, I mean, clearly the one on the right is obviously a caricature. And this is a museum shot of John Curran's show that was at the Whit Museum many, many years ago. But if you guys look at their work, they're both caricatures. Now, granted, different types of caricatures, but to me, there is a pretty close relationship between these two. What do you think, Jordan?
Yeah, I think part of it also is because the two paintings were that you showed with the magazine cover, and the one that I said before the stream reminds me of Jennifer Lawrence. I think that there's just the styles are so different. You have this one on the right by John Curran that's very much reminds you of the Renaissance and that painting style. And then you have Anita Kunz, who's doing something that's very fun and very exaggerated. And when you showed the other ones, like with the girl with the bubble gum and things like that, they're slightly more similar. There's caricature there, but it's not as extreme. And so I think that's where that line you're talking about is really difficult to parse through sometimes.
W315 is saying, if you create your own story concept and illustrate it, then what? You try to publish it and sell it, right? Yep. I mean, that's much harder to do than, for example, doing an editorial illustration. For example, on the right-hand side, this is Anita Kunz as an illustrator, and we've got John Curran on the left. And so it's one thing to work for the New York Times and do an editorial illustration. It's another thing to come up with your own story, illustrate, and try to sell it. So there are so many different versions of being an illustrator. And of course, same thing with the fine artist. But Jordan, don't you think these two images sort of eerily similar? Like, they're both women with yellow and they're both exaggerated. I just find, to me, I look at these two, I'm like, I could go either way. What do you think?
Yeah, I would say so. They have a lot of similarities. And I think, honestly, part of what I think pushes the illustrator aspect on Kunz's drawing or painting more is just how whimsical the hair is. And there's more liberties being taken into the pushing and pulling of the lines or value, or whatever you guys want to call it. With Curran, it's pushed, but you could still feel the realism that he's going for in this.
Isaac is saying, illustration, the message is conveyed at face value mostly. Fine art isn't necessarily as revealing. So here's the thing. Let's step back for a minute from all the comments and from what Jordan and I are saying. The definition I would get from the conversation so far is that illustration is more whimsical, more playful, more of a caricature, tells a story. Fine art does not tell a story. It's more realistic, and it is something that doesn't have a particular purpose, is trying to serve. That's what we're getting at this point. However, wow, we've got some other examples for you guys. And by the way, I am so proud of this, you guys. Anita Kunz is in an Art Prof video. I was like, oh my God, like blown away, because she's somebody who's been such a major figure in illustration since the 1980s. She's been around forever and ever. And she actually donated a little clip to this video where she gives people graduation advice. So if you want to go back and watch the stream, we do have timestamps if you want to go and find her clip. I'm just so proud. I just have to really show off about this, Jordan.
Like,
Anita Kunz is in an art prof video. Oh my God. Okay, so let's look at the next bunch of artists. And we have a crit clash on John Curran. So if you guys want to dig deeper into his work, definitely take a look. And this one definitely does not fulfill the more realistic, less caricatured version, Jordan.
it's true. I cannot argue with that.
Okay, so we have two more people. Tell us which one you think is the illustrator, which one you think is the painter. And let's start to open this up, because I think it is easy in some of these to say the stereotypical versions of illustration, but I think you guys will see it's not really that clear. Neil is saying, what about Caravaggio and peeps like him? What do you think, Jordan?
That's interesting, because at the time Caravaggio was around, like the illustration industry as we know it today wasn't really in existence the same way. Like you weren't being hired to do like magazine covers and, you know, Rolling Stones articles and stuff like that. So it's challenging when you ask something like that. But he definitely did a lot of paintings that were like illustrations of the Bible and all these really great works. So honestly, he can go either way. I'm not really sure what I would label him as. What do you think, Clara?
Well, the thing is, he is known in history as a painter. When you bring up Caravaggio, people don't say illustrator. They say painter. And yet, as you're saying, a lot of the times the paintings that Caravaggio was doing, they were commissions from the church. And if it's a commission from the church, they have to make sure if it's a Bible story that people understand that Bible story. I mean, it's not very good if you have a Bible story painting and people are like, what's happening? Like, that's not good at all. And so that's a really great point you bring up, Neil, is that there are a lot of artists who you look at, you're like, they're totally illustrators. They were totally telling the story of the sacrifice of Isaac. Really important. Daniela is asking, while you guys deliberate, can there be illustrations that are realistic? What do you say, Jordan?
You know, I think yes, but I noticed that pretty much every artist has their own unique style. And there are some times where a painting to me or a drawing or whatever looks very realistic, but then you give that prompt to another artist and they do it completely differently, even though it still looks realistic. Some people will expand the eyes or, you know, put more blush in the cheeks or something like that. And so it's, yes, but it also really depends on the artist that you're talking about.
I mean, I would say, Daniela, a really good example of an illustrator who does work fairly realistically, I mean, at least compared to stuff like this, would be Chris Van Allsburg, who illustrated Jumanji, The Polar Express, or somebody like, who's that other person? It totally slipped my mind right now. But the point is, there's a lot of illustrators who do work that way. So I don't think illustration and painting, it's like, oh, you got to work on this style. Okay, so let's take a closer look and see what people are saying about which is which. Go ahead, Jordan.
Oh man, so we see left painter, right illustrator. Then we see painter left, illustrator right, left painter, painter left. So most of these look like the painting is on the left and the illustration is on the right.
Okay, so we have more of a consensus. And W315 says all those altarpieces and saints and allegories were made to order, so aren't they illustrations? Well, what do you say, Jordan? Because there definitely was a client. Caravaggio was hired by the church. It was a commission. He didn't just walk around painting those things.
Yeah, I guess it depends on how and when you're going to classify these things. Because like I said, he was hired by the church for sure, but it's also a slightly different time. And they were just known as painters. So it's almost like, was the egg or the chicken that came first? And it's like yes, but also no, but also yes at the same time. That's a good discussion, actually. Maybe that's a future video. Who knows?
All right, guys, let's tell you which is which. On the left-hand side, I am not going to be able to pronounce his name correctly. Shabalala Self, who is a very new painter. She's very hot right now in New York City. She just had a show at the ICA in Boston. And we have Ed Young on the right-hand side, who has illustrated tons and tons of children's books. So again, here, we're showing the context. Self is in a white cube gallery. Ed Young is on the cover of tons and tons of children's books. Chances are you guys know his work because he's been all over the place. You maybe are not as familiar with the name. So Jordan, now that we've looked at more of these, do you think Ed Young is giving himself away as an illustrator?
Honestly, no, not to me. I feel like when you put these two artists side by side, I actually struggled. For a second, I was like, are these the same artists? Like the styles were so similar to me. And I was actually kind of impressed that everyone was, or not everyone, but a lot of people were saying left painter, right illustrator. And so this is one of those examples where the line is so blurred to the point where I almost can't even pinpoint which artist really I would label as which.
For sure. And this is a great question from Ron Nuck. Is there any artist who excels at both painting and illustrations? I totally believe an artist can do that. Do you think that's possible, Jordan, to have these dual lives that exist, 1 foot in painting, 1 foot in illustration?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of times where people can just wear certain hats. There are times where, let's say I'm working on a project, there are times where I have to wear a storyboarding hat and I have to put that on and think about my project in that way. And then I have to think about designing a character for a game. And that's differently than how I approach it for animation. And so when you start putting these labels and you start recognizing what the goal is and your purpose in it, then you could definitely put all those hats on and at different times depending on when you need it.
See, I disagree with you, Jordan, because as somebody who's worked in the fine arts world, I'm sorry to tell you guys this, but there are so many fine artists will totally turn their nose up at illustrators. And a lot of the painters, I'm sorry to say, they see illustration as a lower life form. I totally disagree. And I think that's a bunch of crap, but it exists. You definitely meet fine artists who think they're better than the illustrators because, oh, the illustrators are so commercial and there's so much about industry and they've given in and sold out. And it's not about their true artistic soul and stuff like that. The reason I think you can't have your cake and eat it too is that from a marketing point of view, once people see you as an illustrator, they're very unlikely to embrace you as a fine artist. And same thing with the other way around. Now, there are some exceptions, like we saw John Curran did that magazine cover, but it's more like that where people just like dip in and they do one thing and they leave. I don't really know anybody who is in both worlds equally. It's really, really hard to say.
Yeah.
This is interesting. Juan Chang is saying, aren't political artists considered illustrators? They are making something that serves a specific purpose. What do you think, Jordan?
I guess it depends. Like, are you talking about those paintings or pieces of artwork that are done as like portraits of like a president or something like that, or something that's more commercial for like a magazine illustration? Because
I mean, I would say political cartoonists, for sure, they're an illustration. But when you get into people that talk about politics, that's more complicated, don't you think?
oh, definitely. That's always really challenging to pull off. And again, it's the line being blurred. There's a certain point where I don't want to say it's pointless to talk about the conversation, like to try and pinpoint and designate a specific role for somebody. But I guess the end goal is, did it accomplish what it was meant to accomplish, the artwork? And at that point, then I think the conversation starts moving to, well, was this piece successful, rather than is it an illustration or is it a painting?
Okay, let's take a look at the next set of artists. And by the way, I forgot to say this earlier, but if you guys know for sure this image is by who, you probably shouldn't vote. So the people who vote should be the people who do not know the artist necessarily. Otherwise, you're a little bit biased. Okay, so we've got a painter, we've got an illustrator. Tell us in the chat what you guys think, who is who, left or right. And while you guys do that, I want to address this question from Erica. Would you say the approach changes depending on what serves the idea best? Like the focus or the lens changes, as some call for more storytelling, some call for more ambiguity. What's your take, Jordan?
Yeah, I think I'll tell you this. When I was in school, we would have concept classes, and we would all get the same exact prompt, and we would each go away for a week and come back with something. And it always surprised me how different everyone's interpretation of something like a phrase like lost and found, or maybe an idiom or something like that, how different everyone's thought process was, because you have different people who grew up in different countries, different lifestyles, different ethnicities, and different genders, all these random things and even experiences in their life. So I don't know if I've never seen anyone come up with the exact same interpretation as another artist when it's the same prompt.
Oh, never. I mean, I love that part about being a teacher. It's like I can give the same assignment for 10 years, and I did for a long, long time. And it's like no matter how many times I signed it, people would come up with something different. So it's always really, really interesting to see that. Okay, so this time we have less of a consensus. Raphael says right illustration. Megan is saying left illustrator. And Moses says the right looks like the cover to an edgy magazine. Well, the question is, what edgy magazine are you talking about? Goom Bonica says they're both very difficult sets of skills to achieve. Too bad the two groups can't accept that the other also works hard. That's disheartening. I know, it's obnoxious. Don't you think, Jordan?
Oh, very, very obnoxious. I think it's silly arguments, honestly.
Guys, let's see who it is. Some of you guys guessed it. Francis Bacon, who is clearly known as a fine art painter. We have Marshall Arisman on the left-hand side, who's an illustrator.
I just like how Daniel was like, I know who this is. Francis Bacon. Damn, got it.
So I'm curious, for those of you guys, what's the difference here? What made you think Marshall Arisman was a painter? Because to me, they're so similar. Like, out of all the pairings we gave you, this is the one where I don't see the difference. Like, to me, they're the same. I don't know. What do you think they were similar as I do, Jordan?
Oh, yeah. I was stumped. I was almost like, please don't ask me beforehand. I have no idea. I'm stuck.
But the thing is, we've got Marshall Arisman on the left-hand side on the cover of Time magazine, and we've got Francis Bacon showing in a white cube gallery. And actually, what's very funny is I met Marshall Arisman because he came to RISD when I was a student to do a lecture. He's one of those artists. He looks like his paintings. Like a little bit creepy. Like, he's a brilliant artist. I mean, I love his work and it's like super intense, but he's one of those artist who looks like his artwork. It's like Edward Gorey with his like creepy beard and everything.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah. So this is very interesting because we're getting all these different comments. Moses is saying, oh my God, I didn't recognize Bacon. His stuff is mostly more violent. I feel like this one is more soft. GSD is saying they are both conceptual. And Megan B is saying the one on the left looked more collage-y to me. And Adrian is saying the one on the right is smoother. Okay, I better go back to the original image that we were looking at before. But I don't know, to me, I'm like, why do we even need to categorize who's an illustrator and who's a painter? What do you think?
Yeah, with this one in particular, like I feel like in typical art prof fashion, we start with the more easy ones where you can go like, okay, clear as day, night, that kind of thing. This one is so close. And like I said before, I was almost intimidated. I was like, I don't know what the real difference is here. The composition is almost exactly the same. The colors are very similar. There's a little bit of collage in one, but painters and illustrators use collage. So I was like, I can't use that as a tool anymore. So it's tricky, especially when you get this close down to the line.
I mean, don't these paintings have like the same color scheme? Like, I think it's just eerie.
Yeah, it's freaky. I'm gonna have nightmares now.
I mean, Marshall Arisman's work, it's so intense. And what he said to us at the talk when I was a student, which is really funny, is he said, yep, anytime somebody gets shot and murdered, I get the phone call to do the illustration. Like, I guess as an illustrator, like an actor, you can get pigeonholed into doing certain types of illustrations. And that was Marshall Arisman's thing, was these violent, murdersome looking illustrations. And we've got a great comment from Emily It looks like he painted Mystique from X-Men. It's all about Jennifer Lawrence today, you guys, isn't it? Although that's not why I watch X-Men. You guys know why I watch X-Men.
No, we know why you watch X-Men.
I gotta get my Magneto time in, right? He's
no judgment. I'm just saying we all know.
Raphael is saying, the thing is, I didn't pay much attention to this since I just thought it's industry drama, since a work can be illustrative or fine art, and I figured it's just the fine art market, not the, looks like this got cut off a little bit. But, oh, here we go. They are saying fine art, creative in general, like how they downplayed crafts to what work women do when they look so much more fine arty than what the men did at those times. I know, right? It's like when you really come down and you look at so many different examples, I just am like, why can't we just call everybody an artist? Like, what's the big fuss? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Sure. I would assume it has something to do with money, but that's probably about as far as I can really go.
Thank you, Sleipnir. You see, Sleipnir understands me, Jordan. I'm not crazy. You know what I mean? All right, guys. What I'm going to tell you now is that Art Prof has a podcast, and we are available on Spotify and also on iTunes. We would love it if you guys would leave us a rating and a review. And please join us on the Art Prof Discord. We are going to be in the post live streams channel. The invite link is in the video description below, so we can keep having the conversation. And subscribe to our YouTube channel and join the Art Prof family. And thank you so much to our top Patreon supporters who make everything possible. Thank you to everybody for your comments in the chat. So great to hear such a diverse range of opinions. You guys talk about so many things that honestly never crossed our minds before. So we thank you guys so much for that. Everybody, we will see you in the Discord. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye.